Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Roski talk today with our art historian, critic, curator, Matthew Schum. We have a tradition here where our graduate students introduce each one of our speakers. So I am going to introduce Sophia Stevenson, who will in turn introduce Matthew. Sophia?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending. I have the pleasure of introducing our visiting writer and curator, Matthew Schum. He is a writer based in Los Angeles and is from Minneapolis. He holds a PhD from the University of California, San Diego, specializing in modern art history and contemporary exhibition practices. He has written widely on international art, edited several artist books for leading publishers, and taught at various universities. As a curator, he has produced numerous exhibitions and commissions with contemporary artists for LAX Art, Desert X 2019 in Coachella Valley, and LAN Los Angeles Nomadic Division. His research intersects micropolitics, working class identity, regionalism, art, and ecology. I want to give a warm welcome to Matthew, and if we were in person, we would be clapping, but I just kind of want to motion to welcome him. Everyone, thank you.
And everyone, we appreciate it if starting now, when Matthew is speaking, that you would mute your sound. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Now. And Sophia, thanks for the great introduction. What I've prepared for you today is a PowerPoint, and it's somewhat topical. And what I'm hoping is that this is a lecture that can lead into some of our discussion during the seminar. And the key term here is going to be developed throughout the lecture, and it kind of creates a through line through my work. So instead of just talking about my work in some sort of chronological fashion, I tried to take one piece of the way I try to work as a curator and try to draw that out through a series of examples. So I'm going to move into my PowerPoint now, and I look forward to having some questions afterwards. Karen's let me know that we're going to add any of the questions you have to the chat, and I feel like you can add those anytime you want to.
Yes, we will allow for about 10 minutes at the end of the hour for our public visitors to ask questions, and I ask the students to please hold theirs for the seminar. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Thumbs up? Okay, great. So this is a lecture on curating and what I call critical regionalism. And so I'm taking this term from Okwuenuizer. It's something that certainly comes up in different fields. The term is actually maybe familiar to some of you from architecture. But when we're talking about curating and critical regionalism, at least how I use it, I'm talking about economies and art and the non-aligned character that certain art projects can have. So critical regionalism concerns a parallel addition to a larger territory of the quote art world. And we're also talking, of course, about how there's not necessarily an opposition between the center and the periphery, but that there are other art worlds out there that, especially as a curator trying to work in a critical fashion, you can find through the exhibition form. In addition, I want to say that I don't see this provincialism of dominant economies as simply related to location, but that I also think of it in terms of institutions. So I think when I read someone like Okuyenmizer and I think about his amazing career that he had, I'm also thinking about the sort of provincialism that you have to move through when you're talking about institutions. So the provinces, in my mind, are very much often institutions. My idea of curating, I should probably let you know, is not necessarily institutional. In fact, I'm very much interested in what I would call an extra institutional, kind of intervening in everyday life. So this is a type of curating that doesn't necessarily envision an exhibition inside of a white cube. It moves forward from everyday settings and sites and looks at the opportunity to intervene in everyday life as a kind of laboratory environment where you can highlight, array, cite, stage, identify, collaborate, listen, something that's more dialogical in nature. I should also note that I don't necessarily work from the position of art's primacy or art's autonomy. I'm really interested in art as a kind of parable. And this is certainly something you can critique me for as a curator, but that's to say I see art as a kind of window onto history, and I'm probably just as interested in history as I am in, say, art history and the uses of different media. Critical regionalism is also just one of various considerations. I don't want to create a framework where this is the only thing I'm thinking about when I'm working. But the long and short of it is critical regionalism is to me a way of seeking other art worlds. And in defiance of dominant narratives and in defiance of social narratives that are dominant at any given moment. So when we talk about the provincialism of institutions, I'm thinking of things like what happened in my hometown of Minneapolis at the Walker Art Center, when Sam Durant's scaffold resulted in part from a disengaged curatorial institution. So this is to say that the Walker Art Center was, I think, unfortunately, more tapped into an international art world and the provincialism of that international art world, and perhaps not as in touch with local histories. So the kind of perpetuation of privilege that becomes the mark of institutions in contemporary art and the international art world is something that can lead to a kind of curating of Rolodex instead of sharing ideas. And I think if there was anyone inside of the organization when this happened, you would have a situation where people would know the local history enough to know that this was not necessarily a good idea. So what we're talking about with Sam Durant's piece is Scaffold, which is a compilation of gallows, and it was made as a assemblage of sorts that critiqued capital punishment. The very center of that scaffold is related to the Dakota 38+2, which happened in Mankato, Minnesota in 1862. And this was the largest summary execution in the history of the United States. And it was centered in the sculpture park outside of the Walker Art Center near a major highway. So everyone who drove by there could witness this symbol of mass execution. So it's also worth noting that this piece was not commissioned by the Walker, but debuted in Kassel in 2012 at Documenta 13. And there's absolutely no problem in Germany with this symbol of genocide. Obviously, if you were to use other symbols of genocide in Germany, it may have provoked the local population in a different way. So this is all just to say that I see curating as having a kind of editorial function where you can hopefully engage with the local as well as the international discourse and guide the artwork. So this wasn't necessarily only the Walker not looking at a kind of local history. It also, to me, was not looking at one of my, favorite projects that the Walker ever did by Edgar Heap of Birds. So he was a resident at the Walker in 1990, and he made a piece that memorialized the Dakota 38. And then he put these different sides along the Mississippi, not too far away from the Walker Art Center, and was able to kind of connect Minnesota to this larger history that is not only Native history, but also the history of, say, Lincoln's presidency. At the same time, he's signing the Emancipation Proclamation. He's also signing the order to execute these 38 men who were tried summarily and then hung summarily. This is another piece by Edgar Heap of Birds. So Minnesota Today, your host is Biday Makaska. This is also an interesting piece because this name here is tribal, and it's also the new name of a lake outside of Minneapolis that was originally named after President Calhoun, a very well-known racist. So this is an example of kind of a critical regionalism that Edgar Heap of Birds is picking up on and then goes into a larger discussion within the Twin Cities. So what's another example of a critical regionalism? I think the latest project that I did with Guadalupe Rosales is an example. It was called Channel Flip, Meet Me at the Edge of the Sun. So I think it's safe to say that LA museums have done a subpar job of featuring Latinx artists over the years. And this is also about not being connected to the modern and pre-modern history of Los Angeles. So when I was working with Guadalupe, this was an opportunity to bring her world into view. And the original idea was to create a performance with other artists of her choice. These artists were going to do a performance and then COVID hit. So the idea here was to create a collaborative project and to find a way to work with Guadalupe. And it was really open to her however she would do it. But I was certainly interested in where she was coming from because of the way that Guadalupe works with the crowd and especially the way that she uses the archive. So the archive is something inside of her work that is not working in a typical fashion in terms of artistic material. It would seem to me that she's actually a collaborator with her medium and with her archive that she's creating with other people. All of these artists were able to quickly pivot inside of COVID and make pieces that related to the current moment. So this is to say that they were by no means about Los Angeles, but they certainly brought a critical view about COVID and the politics around health from the LGBTQ community in some cases, and tied it into this new health crisis. So the artists were now Bustamante, Zachary Drucker, Rafa Esparza, and MPA. So I think that this did tie into some degree with other parts of Guadalupe's work to date, because this was a piece about the intimacy of place. And it was very much a collaborative piece in which authorship was shared with everybody who was involved here, to some degree even with me as the organizer and curator. So this is about, working with Guadalupe is about so much more than just East LA, but it's about finding a way to use the archive to kind of deploy an energy that's specific to place. And she has a very unique way of capturing that inside of her archive about the dance and rave scene in the 1990s. So the overall documentation here, I think, was very much about, and not an era, a part of the COVID experience that we're all going through that already seems a long time ago. So this was kind of the first phase of COVID, and the way in which society has shifted makes this already, to my mind, a kind of timepiece. And I hope all of you have had a chance to watch the video. It's about 20 minutes, and it's really quite spectacular. Last thing I'll say about Guadalupe in terms of a critical regionalism is that she's able to locate viewers in an experience of violence that's specific to her life, but I think transmits in a larger way in terms of how she's processing trauma and reshaping it into something, again, that's very positive, very energetic, and celebratory at the end of the day. So to kind of close on this one, each artist, I think, represented their own place with it, and it was a means to kind of intimate the COVID experience, even if that was just contextual. The other ways that I think about critical regionalism is the way in which art kind of locates us, and it returns us to a kind of place of self-witness. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about a project that I did along the Mississippi that takes the river as an example of a critical regionalism. And I think that this gets to the heart of some of the experiences that I'm trying to provide as a curator when I'm working, in terms of delivering a kind of a way for the viewer or the artist to contend with their surroundings. I really see that as the power of contemporary art in some cases. As you may know, there's been a very interesting history of representation of the Mississippi, whether it's Mark Twain's literature or paintings like this one. It's kind of a pastoral tradition, but in many senses, even for me as someone who grew up in a city along the Mississippi, the river kind of disappeared from the popular imagination. And I think with this project, I was looking for a way to reanimate the river as a contested site that has in the last decade become more visible as a culture. So I called the project the Mississippian, and you may notice the kind of whimsical spelling of Mississippi. This is a way to kind of play with the Anglo-American tendency to butcher the indigenous languages, and to also point to the ambiguity of the English language, and therefore, you know, discourse to some degree altogether. The idea of the Mississippi was also to return to a place that was about fresh water, about watersheds, continental divides. And in this part of northern Minnesota, which honestly was actually quite foreign to me, even as someone from the state, possesses some of the oldest earth on earth. So there's these ecological issues, there's these cultural issues, and then there's the matter of trying to find a kind of shared space in terms of the history of this settlement. I called the exhibition that I did, I've done a couple of these, I did an exhibition very close to the headwaters of the Mississippi, which flow from Lake Itasca. I called it First Colony, and I wanted to conjure up the past and think of the old Northwest Territory, and return to this time when the first colony of the United States was the Midwest. So I think that there's a lot of ways in which we think about the Midwest that are very vague, very cliche. And I think it's worth just returning to the beginning, that this land north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi is the United States' first colony. So I was kind of returning to this land, thinking of it in those terms as this colonial space or post-colonial space, and trying to think about how the people relate to that past. Another key part of it is to kind of think about what is our responsibility to the intersecting histories in a place like this. And if we think of the Midwest not simply as this flyover country, but as this place of internal colonization that is still being colonized, how does that change our understanding of the United States today? The really interesting opportunity that came along with this job was taking a series of European master paintings that had been donated to this art center in northern Minnesota, that they weren't sure if they were copies or not. They actually were. In fact, some of the pieces were copies of Rubens, which tipped me off that the work was not original. But it was also clear when you look at the eyes. When you look at the eyes in a painting that's a copy, you have to know whether it's an original or not. So I said, sure, I'll hang your collection of old masters. That sounds great. And what I did is I hung it in this salon style. And then on the left there, you see a contemporary artist, Aaron Spangler, really amazing sculptor who lives up there in northern Minnesota. And I did this in a way to kind of talk about the move away in the United States and places like the Midwest, the move away from like a Euro-American identity to what we could call today a white identity with a capital W. So the idea here in some ways is that white people are still somehow connected to their ethnicity only through a set of very vague ideas. In fact, a lot of people couldn't necessarily come in and name the artist, let alone the kind of parable that's being represented in some of these paintings. But then also to use Aaron's sculpture here to kind of invoke a guardian of something. And he's looking forward to in this kind of confrontational way. So I guess I'm interested in how these lands are inhabited today and how they're still being colonized, just to repeat that point. This is a emerging artist that I met while I was in New York, John Gomez, and he did these really amazing pieces that I think get to the heart of some of the issues with white identity right now, where he took these found photos he'd get at junk shops and he'd just paint over them with blue paint. And it was this kind of violent act, but in some ways it encapsulated the tension of the moment. This was in 2017 when I did this exhibition. And it was right around the time that we were getting going with the current administration. I was also really interested in the idea of cargo and the cargo that comes out of these places like the upper Midwest. This land that we were on is a really kind of fascinating place. There were 200 years of interracial kinship, they call it, between the different traders, many of them coming from France, England later, and then of course the United States. And this whole history of interdependence, starting in the 1600s and lasting until Minnesota became a state, isn't talked about whatsoever in this territory. It's been completely erased. But there was an absolute need for people to be involved with each other's lives in order to kind of benefit from this global trade, which in a place like this was of course first the fur trade. So the fur trade was this global industry that would take these little rodents, these beavers, and turn them into really fancy hats in places like London and France. And I was interested in that transfusion. So these exhibitions I was doing along the Mississippi were kind of clusters of associations that dealt with the violent extraction of natural resources. We're kind of dreaming of places that defy commodification. I'm thinking of Lake Superior or the Mississippi itself. They've done so much to kind of turn it into a place that is only suitable for business, but in other ways it resists that kind of colonial rule, if you will. So thinking of America in terms of like its pre-colonial, pre-American era of kinship, in that I think we are often struck with this idea that we have to find a way out of the current predicament we're in politically through looking at a future, when in some ways, if you looked back to different ways in which kinship worked 300 years ago in a place like northern Minnesota before it had a name, before it was the United States, there's some lessons to be learned there too about how we might approach the land differently. So moving towards another much larger project I did called Desert X in the West, you have here on the right, John Wesley Powell. And he's someone who did a lot to map the West. He classified it as an arid region. And this is a kind of critical regionalism that has to do with water management, because that's such a contested issue in the West. And the kind of ways in which dealing with a figure like Powell is very complicated. Because on one hand, if we had used his late 19th century recommendations for land use, the West would look totally different. About 2% of it would be irrigated, and it might be a healthier place to live. On the other hand, he's someone who is totally dependent upon native guides to get through this land, but he classified human societies into 3 categories in his writing: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. So there's the legacy of the way in which he mapped this land topographically, cartographically, and then there's the residue of his racist beliefs. So how do those intersect in the West, and how are they still visible? Those were some of the things I was thinking about when I started Desert X. And of course, with the West, there's all of these kind of incurable cliches about the land, whether it's manifest destiny or the kind of inveterate thinking around deserts and its biblical propensities. There's also this really deep desire to develop places that are really unfit for development or capitalism and settlement of any kind. So this kind of aspect of an internal colonization was something that I was, again, thinking about, moving from the Mississippi now to places like the Colorado River. So internal colonization refers to an uneven development that's the result of exploiting primarily minority groups within a wider society. And it leads to political and economic inequalities in regions and states that I really do feel like with these larger exhibitions like Desert X, you absolutely have to address. And that was some of the tension that existed inside of the organization when we started choosing artists and choosing themes for Desert X 2019. My whole approach to the desert was, to try and remove it from some of these cliches, was simply to think of the desert as an ancient ocean. So if you start from the point of the desert as an ancient ocean, as a kind of curatorial theme, you are already talking about climate change. Granted, it's not man-made, it's a natural form of climate change, but you start to envision the permeability of the land. So I think this is a critical aspect of critical regionalism. Superflex, the Danish art collaborative, they did a piece that was about ocean rise. The whole Desert X exhibition existed from right where the 111 and the 10 split, all the way down to the Salton Sea. And one thing that I was really adamant about was that we had to move Desert X from the Palm Springs area as much as possible and towards the Salton Sea, to avoid the kind of provincialism of Le Beau Monde, to avoid the provincialism of the art world that exists there, and Palm Springs in general. But this was also a way to try and move the art and the resources that Desert X had towards the places where the laboring classes work. So the Coachella Valley is a place that is developed in such a way, but I think it's really important to imagine how the art functions outside of a place that has art institutions. Here you have Katie Ryan's Ghost Palm. This was a piece that was kind of looking at the artificiality of nature in the region. And here you have Sterling Ruby's Spectre. And one thing I certainly learned from Desert X is that when you place art into the landscape, you place people into the landscape. So if you're just driving by this scene and there's no art there and you're in your car, you're driving by, there's a different sense of embodiment when you park the car, get out and look at something. I do think that you do end up with a situation though where interventions in everyday settings can become location specific even if they don't have content. So that I think is really the trick. How do you find a critical engagement with the land that isn't just importing, plopping down the kind of provincialism that we see in a lot of art galleries and art museums? I think Cara Romero did a really interesting job of working with the landscape. You have here a piece called Jack Rabbit, Cottontail, and Spirits of the Desert. She's taking myths that she learned as a child and putting those myths into photographic form. But then, importantly, she's interceding in the kind of capitalist substrate of the billboard. And obviously, she's commenting on contemporary political issues here with the no wall there above. But this was also for her a kind of a return as an indigenous Californian to this land to kind of reclaim it with these billboards. This was one of the largest projects that I did. And it was with Ivan Ergote. He's originally from Bogota. He's based in Paris now. This piece was really interesting to make because it's so simple, but in another way, it really functioned to create a kind of third space for the audience, which I think was really important. And he's blending here a kind of Pan-American set of architectures. So he had been recently traveling and gone to Mexico and seen the temples there. So there's these pre-Columbian forms that were built into the drawings that he made. And then of course there's the brutalist architectures that use concrete. And I think we even ended up with a kind of trestle bridge inside of the work that he did. So the place that we cited Ivan's work very much intimated this ancient ocean. It was a very different approach than say the more kind of global idea that Superflex was working with, dealing with rising ocean levels. The seashells and centuries-old marine life could be seen on the desert floor around Ivan's sculptures. And this was also a way for me to return to a place that I first bonded with when I came to California in 2005, living in San Diego, and I'd go out to the Salton Sea. And to kind of remove the Salton Sea from this discourse of a disaster zone and start thinking about it as a beautiful place, as an inhabitable place, and to engage with it out of that.
Hey, Matthew.
Yeah.
I'm curious if the thing that happened to Sam Durant at the Walker had happened to one of the artworks in this exhibition, how would you have handled it differently, and would you have felt any desire to try to capture that however you decided to negotiate it? Would there be some document or some relic that would have come out of it at the end? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'll get to that after I finish.
Okay.
So also with Ivan's piece, we're moving away from this tendency to go out to the Salton Sea and take pictures and post them on the internet. Some people call this ruin pornography. It's a way to engage with the land because I don't think it's going to be possible to save the Salton Sea if people aren't going out there. So bringing in the art world to this place and making sure that this exhibition created a kind of corridor across the whole Coachella Valley was very important. Here's an example of the typical way in which the Salton Sea is discussed in the mainstream media. Here's another picture of Yvonne's piece. So there were 5 platforms positioned on this site that gave you a great view of the Salton Sea. This is a piece by Mary Kelly. And this is a series of bus stops that she painted Lamborghini yellow and tied into the women's strike for peace. She's really talking about the hundreds of explosions that took place between 1945 with the development of the atomic bomb and were dropped as tests across the Southwest desert. But essential feature of this is also the doomsday clock and how we've been moving closer to midnight, nuclear midnight, over the last several years. You'll notice in the light box there a photograph, and this is taken from a very important feminist anti-nuclear activist group called the Women's Strike for Peace. And this whole piece started with research that Mary did that became a kind of counter history to nuclear energy, but also the militarism that exists out there in the desert. And I think the purpose of Mary Kelly's piece was kind of to add this to the landscape, to think about daily life as connected to this larger history of militarism in the region. You can see there on the right the nuclear clock, and then on the left is a map of various sites that are related to the military history, whether it's bases or places where nuclear energy has been released. But just to close on Mary's piece, and I want to be mindful of time here, the idea here, I think, is partially the passivity that we're put into under the umbrella of the military-industrial complex. And it's a passivity that's not so different than waiting for a bus, if you will. And I think this piece really worked as a beautiful artwork on the sidewalk, and they're actually still out there if you want to go see them. But it's also a piece that takes the nuclear clock and ties it into other circuitries of time. So moving on to post-commodities piece for Desert X. This piece really got into the kind of key regionalism of the Palm Springs region, which is the mid-century home. It exists in many forms, sought to meticulously question the mid-century plan for living and to essentially use the mid-century home as a framework for considering land stewardship in a place like the Coachella Valley and the larger California desert. The rendering you see above here is a house called the Wave House. And the Wave House was a kind of proof of concept with this undulating roof made by an architect named Walter White. The piece involved interviewing a host of mid-century modern homeowners in the Palm Springs region, taking recordings across the desert outside of Palm Springs and other places. It even involved recordings of the San Andreas Fault and different seismic recordings to create a sound piece inside of this mid-century home. Ultimately, there's kind of a sensate set of clusters, associations, and anxieties that are released. What's also very beautiful about this work is that the roof was a kind of resonator or speaker that amplifies. Give you a little taste of the work. And this was in the middle of the house being renovated. So this tendency to renovate these gems of architecture is being played with here too. So there's a very much a kind of working class aesthetic that they're intervening on here. So the kind of international style that was imported to Palm Springs is here being put into relief and taken as a somewhat exclusive desert discourse that's a little bit dismissive of other histories that exist in a place like Palm Springs. Okay, this is one of the last pieces that I'll talk about. The Terminal Lake Exploration Platform is the project of Steve Badgett and Chris Taylor. They originally launched it at the site of Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. And the Terminal Lake Exploration Platform is essentially a boat or a pontoon that goes to terminal lakes and explores the land from the vantage of the lake. Here's some people enjoying the Great Salt Lake. And what I wanted to do, since the Salton Sea was so central to the curatorial focus, was to put a boat on the Salton Sea. It's California's biggest lake, and it's absent of boats, of course, because of the water being acrid and not fit for recreation. So what these guys did is they brought the Terminal Lake Exploration platform out, and they kind of used the boat to build a different discourse around the Salton Sea and to think of it more symbolically in ways that are related to the history of land art. And terminal lakes are really important because unlike lakes that say flow into a river or have other bodies of water connected to it, terminal lakes capture the surrounding environment. So they entail all of the sort of traces of environmental decay or health that might be found in the region. Of course, the Salton Sea's one of the main sources of water going into the Salton Sea these days is agricultural runoff. So the Terminal Lake Exploration Platform brought some attention to a stressed ecosystem. But this was another example of bringing the province of the art world into this other remote location. Lastly, thinking about Yvonne's piece, which was about thinking about the desert before there was white settlers there. That was thinking about pre-Columbian history, thinking about climate change on these more kind of oceanic timeframes. The Salton Sea itself, and I think the Terminal Lake Exploration Platform brought attention to this, is experiencing climate change at a very rapid rate. Even in the last 10 years, it's changed quite a bit. So there's a real need to bring attention to it. So to kind of close here, what I'm proposing with the critical regionalism is curating spaces and environments that kind of capture a dialogue or create a more dialogical connection to the land. I am certainly interested in how art and curating can kind of accept its limits and embrace the ephemerality of artworks. And I think that actually working with ephemerality, like we did with Desert X, some of these other projects I've talked about here today, that's really the way to kind of bring a meaningful set of sites into the fold as kind of temporary laboratories for a community. And I do think it's essential that this work is done outside of institutions, and that art does more than advance institutional privilege of various sorts. So that's my take on critical regionalism, and I'd love to engage with you guys, get to Edgar's question, and I thank you for listening to this lecture.
Thank you. Edgar, are you still with us?
Yeah, we're not moving.
I would like to invite Edgar to go first, but then anyone in the audience is welcome to post questions to the chat while we're starting the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess at the root of my question, Matthew, is like, how do we frame how when things go wrong so that they become additional insights? So I was curious, having seen a number of artists, artists whose projects have sort of, and institutions let them get put through the ringer without seeing it as an opportunity. I was just curious if that had happened to you, how you imagine how you would have handled it, and then on the back end, would you have felt some obligation or desire to archive that exchange, or would you just sort of just let it go, or would you feel some desire to document it and try to preserve that engagement?
Well, the first thing I want to say is the way that Olga Vizo, the director of the Walker at the time, managed the crisis fallout from the Sam Durant piece was, I think, exemplary. And I think the way that the board treated her afterwards is an example of misogyny. I don't think that if there was a man in her position who did the work that she did to try and bring Native communities in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and the 5-state area into the fold, I think she did a lot of the work right, and that in some way she's a great example of how you handle crises like these.
Yeah.
I don't know though that the initial impulse to bring the piece to Minneapolis was rooted in a local understanding of culture. So I think if you understand the pain in Minnesota that exists because of things like the Dakota 38+2 and many other incidences, it's ongoing. They didn't just stop in 1862, 4 years after Minnesota became a state. They continue. I think if you start putting some of that knowledge into the bank before there's a crisis, that's a great way to handle the crises that are inevitable. I don't think that, curating is the easiest thing to sort of critique, and curating is really easy, an easy target. But I do think some of what's going on here is that there's a tendency for museums and institutions not to engage with working class histories, or histories of people who are underserved. And, the problem is not that they're not sensitive enough. The problem is that these institutions are set up to perpetuate privilege. So that's just to say that I don't know that there's a lot of connection being made between the way in which, say, the patronage system functions inside of museums, especially powerful museums like the Walker and other places, and the mistakes that they do. I do think that there's a real unfortunate culture emerging inside of, say, the trustees at the Walker Arts Center, that led not only to this sort of situation, but also the mistreatment of people like, Olga Vizo. So I don't know how to answer your question except to say that there's no way to do curating without being critiqued. You have to accept try and anticipate what kind of critiques you're going to get. And I can go through different critiques that we did get throughout Desert X and how we tried to deal with them. Because inside of Desert X, there was very much a schism between what me and my partner as co-curators were trying to do and what the organization from a more top-down level was trying to do. So that's the other part here too, is I'm sure within the Walker, in fact, I know there was certain tensions before the Sam Durant piece happened. And I like Sam. I'm friends with his wife, Anna, and I really appreciate what he was trying to do with that piece. And I saw it in Documenta, and as a Minnesotan, I knew the history, and it raised an eyebrow but it didn't bother me. Once they brought it to Minneapolis, and this is where Sight comes in, it became a totally different piece.
Right.
So many moving parts inside of a work like that, that you just have to think these things through as well as you can.
Yeah, I just want to cite one thing. I know we can move on to other people, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the artist Michael Heiser, he did a piece in Detroit called Drag Mass Displacement in the early 1970s that, was just a few years after the Detroit riots. If you guys aren't familiar with the collision between earthworks and the politics of Detroit in the 1960s and the 70s, then you guys should look up that work, Drag Mass Displacement. Yeah, thank you, Matthew.
Matthew, just before we leave the situation with the Durant sculpture, I just wanted to ask you a question. Having worked at the Walker in the 90s and being familiar with many of those people, what really astonishes me that some of the curators who have been there for a long time were well aware of these contested histories. I mean, all through the 90s, the Walker was in fact very focused on trying to mend the fences with particularly indigenous communities, but all communities of color. So it really felt to me like a huge retrenchment in both the tenor and position of the museum. But as I mentioned, I was there back in the Kathy Hallbreich days, but long before Olga was there. So maybe you could let us know what you know about why the curators themselves, who well understood the situation with the various communities, kind of were not able to thwart this bad decision.
Yeah, I suppose I'm one of those people who judges others by what they do, not what they say. And I think you're right that there probably was an awareness of these contested histories to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
What they ended up doing is they seemed to try and replicate this Kathy Hallbreich sort of era in the 1990s when the international art world was growing in a certain way, and bringing that to a place like Minneapolis at a certain purchase that I don't think it did in the last decade. So I think this is also about the shifting priorities inside of international art and its inability to keep up with the local discourse. Mm-hmm. So I think that there was probably some awareness that this wasn't a good idea, and I do think that the Walker has an amazing history, and certainly when you were there were a lot of really stellar shows. And there has been retrenchment is the right word. A move away from that. But what ends up happening now is every time that they work with a Native artist, it feels like tokenism.
Right.
They did not do the work beforehand. So that's how I tried to answer Edgar's question. And I just think it's to some degree about being honest about what your limitations are as a curator and knowing that you can only do so much to incorporate these histories into your program. And we all have our own history that we try and incorporate into our work, but you have to do some of this work beforehand. And you have to respond to the moment and maybe take your cues from the history of a place or the history in society more largely when you're doing your work, instead of just institutional history, which I think a lot of museums in LA right now are caught up in and struggling with. They're more caught up in their own history than what's going on in the world.
That's a very good point.
That's how I think about it. But I do think there's this really strange, and I as a Catholic, Irish Catholic, I'd say it's a white Anglo-Saxon problem. There's a tendency in art to try and find a position where you can't be critiqued, and I don't believe in that. So I just want to get that out there, that whatever you do as an artist or a curator, it's going to be critiqued. So I think it's important to just sort of embrace that and try and find the place that you're coming from and where you want to be critiqued.
We have a question from Caro Gonzalez. Caro, would you like to read your question?
Thank you. Hi, Liloma. Thank you for your talk. As an American Indian, specifically Chemehuevi, and most of the art that you've talked about is on my tribe's stolen land. As an artist, my art is deeply cited within activism, As I've been an organizer for 15 years, it has been almost embarrassing to see artists parachute into my community, then bounce while not looking into how their art affects the long-term strategy of community-determined solutions. I have a set of rules I give to artists about how they engage in site specificity and political art. What would your recommendations be for artists who aren't thinking critically about how their art interacts with the lived reality of marginalized people? And then also the second part of my question is, as someone who is from Minneapolis, what do you think of the art world's reaction to the rebellion after George Floyd's lynching? Heavy question, sorry.
No, those are great questions, and I appreciate it. And I want to make clear that I think my understanding of Native history is always going to be limited as a white person and as a white curator. But I do think that you have to, as a white person, try and find a space between the Native history, work with your limitations, and find a place for that to work inside of your practice. As far as citing the work, we did everything we could to reach out to Native communities, but a lot of this work can't be done at the curatorial level, just administratively. It has to be done over years inside of an organization and perhaps decades. So to some degree, the way in which we brought this work in, the best we could probably do is stick to the kind of Wilderness Act approach to it and make sure that we left no trace and tried to bring in as big of a community as we could. But this is exactly where you can critique Desert X, and I don't think that you can move forward trying to dismiss that critique. I think it's out there, it exists, and it's the problem with the organization. It's the problem with that type of curating. What I'm proposing is that there's a critical regionalism there, where you can accept that critique and move forward, bring these artworks there, and try to develop relationships that develop a temporary community around the artwork. But the longer piece that you're asking about with the duration, that has to happen at an organizational level. It certainly would help if there were more, I think, Native curators brought into the fold so that it's not just white people trying to present these Native issues. And that's something that institutionally, whatever you're talking about is just not really happening yet. And so I would go back to something that I think about as a working class person. How many curators do you know who are working class? I don't know many others. So this gets into some class issues as well for me. But I do think that we're in a situation, especially institutionally, where again, this is about the perpetuation of privilege. So that involves bringing people in as curators who can work with privileged collectors and privileged artists. It's really very, very much part of the culture. As far as George Floyd's murder, I think that police brutality has been a major problem in Minneapolis for a very long time. And I would even go as far as to say it's been worse in Minneapolis than in other places, which is quite an accomplishment. I had experiences as a young person, a white person, that were very bad with police, and they were obviously in communities that I lived in that were underserved communities, a word I don't like, but I'm using right now. And they were over-policing. So this is systemic. This is an issue that goes along with the segregation that happens inside of Minneapolis, but it's also a product of the culture there not dealing with it. So we can get into this kind of right-wing narrative about how liberal cities are failing to serve minority communities. The other problem here, though, is that we're also dealing with this kind of warrior culture where men go into places and just exact violence on other people. They have different ways of objectifying people, dehumanizing them. And I think that's a central feature of policing today. So this way in which violence is amongst men perpetuated, tolerated, and in some cases encouraged, it's a kind of mental illness that has to be addressed. So George Floyd's murder was really horrific. But the response to it that I saw, as much as it was a national movement that was part of BLM, those were local communities rising up after decades of being mistreated by the police. So that's what I saw when the 3rd precinct burned. And it does tie into an international movement, but these are local tensions. And the reason why people are upset is because they've been abused by the police for a very long time in Minneapolis. And it's a very specific type of abuse that happens in every city. And we can talk about police brutality broadly, but I think that it's important to look at how Minneapolis has perpetuated this type of violence.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Carol. I'm sorry, but we're at time right now. So I want to thank Matthew very much for a wonderful Roski talk. And for those of you that are part of the general public, we please ask you to log off. If you'd like to write any other chat questions, you may, and we will forward them to Matthew. Everyone else in the Visiting Artist Seminar and Matthew, let's take a break and meet back here at 11:15. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.